When someone deliberately tries to make you angry, do you actually know what they are doing? Yes, it seems personal. It seems like they have a problem with you specifically. It seems like the anger rising in your chest is a natural and justified response. That is what most people believe. But behind that provocation, there is something far more calculated going on. Something that most people completely miss in the moment it is happening. Because here is what most people don't realize. Your anger is not a reaction, it is a resource, and the person provoking you knows exactly how to extract it. Every time someone successfully makes you angry, they have taken something from you. Your clarity, your composure, your ability to respond from a position of strength rather than a position of heat. And they have done it without lifting a hand. Just words, just timing, just the right push in the right place. The Stoics called this the most dangerous vulnerability a person can have. Not weakness of body, not lack of resources, the inability to govern your own reaction. And they built a precise system for closing that vulnerability permanently. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how provocation works at a psychological level, why your anger is the goal and not the side effect, and the one Stoic practice that makes you genuinely impossible to destabilize. And by the way, we will get into what happens to the person provoking you when their tactic stops working. Stay until the end, because that part changes everything. So why does someone provoke you in the first place? Most people assume it is emotional, that the person is frustrated, threatened, or simply immature. End of story. They are just reacting. But here's the thing. Deliberate provocation is almost never emotional on the side of the person doing it. It is strategic. It is a probe. And here is what it is probing for. When someone pushes you and you react with anger, you have just handed them an extraordinary amount of information. You have shown them exactly where your threshold is. You have demonstrated that you can be moved. You have revealed which specific words, tones, or topics bypass your reasoning and go straight to your nervous system. And you have confirmed that they have power over your internal state, which means they have power over your decisions, your words, and your behavior in any future interaction. Epictetus understood this with a precision that most modern psychologists are still catching up to. He taught that we are disturbed not by things that happen to us, but by the judgments we make about them. The person who provokes you is not causing your anger. They are triggering a judgment you already hold. And that judgment is the actual target. This is also why the most skilled provocateurs never raise their voice. They do not need to. A perfectly placed comment, delivered calmly in the right context, can produce rage in someone else without the provocateur showing a single, visible emotion. They remain calm. You do not. And the gap between your emotional states is where their power lives. And by the way, there is a specific pattern they use to do this that we will get into at the end, because understanding the pattern is what lets you see it coming before it lands. Have you ever noticed that the provocation always seems to arrive at exactly the wrong moment? When you are tired, when you are already stressed, when something else has already gone wrong that day, when you are in a room where losing your composure will cost you the most. That is not a coincidence. It is calculated. Here's what most people don't realize. Skilled provocateurs operate using what behavioral researchers call emotional timing, the practice of deploying a trigger at the precise moment when the target's psychological defenses are lowest. They read microsignals, the slight tension in your posture, the shorter responses, the way your jaw sets when you are already carrying something, and they wait. Not always consciously. Sometimes it is pure instinct, refined through years of social observation. But the result is the same. The provocation lands hardest when you are least equipped to absorb it. This is also connected to a mechanism called Amygdala hijack, a term coined by psychologist Daniel Goleman to describe what happens when an emotional threat bypasses the prefrontal cortex, the reasoning and judgment center, and goes straight to the amygdala, the threat response center. When that happens, rational thought does not just slow down. It stops. You are no longer thinking. You are reacting. And a person in pure reaction mode is exactly what a skilled provocateur needs you to be. Think about that for a second. The anger you feel is not yours in that moment. It is a state that was engineered for you, delivered at a time chosen by someone else, designed to produce a response that serves their purposes rather than yours. Ever wonder why the most powerful people in history were almost impossible to provoke in public? Maybe it is the general who sat completely still while being openly insulted by a political rival in the Roman Senate. Maybe it is the negotiator who smiled warmly at a direct personal attack in a high-stakes room. Maybe it is the executive who responded to a calculated public humiliation with a single sentence and silence. That pattern is not accidental. It is trained. Here is something that might surprise you. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journals, not for anyone else to read, that he would begin each morning by reminding himself that he would encounter meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, and envious people that day. He was the most powerful man on earth. He still prepared specifically for provocation every single morning, because he understood that power without emotional discipline is not power at all. It is just potential, waiting to be exploited. Watch how this decoding works in practice. If someone provokes you in public, they are testing your threshold. If they provoke you privately first and then publicly, they already know your threshold and they are using it. If the provocation comes immediately after a compliment or a moment of warmth, that is intermittent reinforcement being weaponized. They are using positive social currency to lower your guard before the strike. If they provoke and then immediately seem remorseful, they are managing the aftermath. If they provoke and then play the victim when you respond, they were never after your anger. They were after your apology. And hey, if this is making you see provocation differently right now, subscribe and help us reach more people who need to understand what is actually happening in the interactions around them. Now, not everyone who provokes reacts the same way when their tactic stops working. There are 4 distinct types and each one tells you something completely different about who you are dealing with. The first type is the pressure tester. This person is not malicious. They provoke as a way of measuring safety. They push to see if you will explode, abandon them, or become unpredictable. When you do not react, they do not escalate. They actually relax. The absence of your anger tells them the environment is stable. This is the person whose provocation is essentially a question disguised as an attack. The question is, are you safe? The second type is the attention harvester. They provoke because your reaction, any reaction, is the output they need. Anger, frustration, even visible irritation confirms that they matter enough to affect you. Your emotional response is the validation they came for. When you stop reacting, they do not escalate either. They move on, because a person who cannot be moved cannot feed the need. The third type is the control architect. This is the more dangerous profile. They provoke methodically and deliberately to establish and maintain a power dynamic. They need to know they can move you at will. Your anger is not the goal in itself. It is evidence of their access to your internal state. When you stop reacting, this person escalates. They try new angles. They go deeper, because losing access to your reaction is losing the control mechanism entirely. And then there is the fourth type, the rarest and most calculated of all, the strategic destabilizer. This person provokes you specifically in contexts where your emotional reaction will cost you something. A negotiation, a public setting, a professional environment, a relationship where your composure matters. They do not want to see you angry for its own sake. They want the consequences of your anger to land on you, while they watch from a calm distance. The provocation is not the attack. Your reaction is the attack they arranged for you to deliver on yourself. Have you ever noticed that after a successful provocation, you spend hours, sometimes days, replaying the moment, replaying what they said, replaying what you wish you had said, rehearsing the argument you never finished, carrying a conversation that is over in a body that cannot put it down? That is not a coincidence. It is a behavioral imprint. Epictetus taught that we are disturbed not by events, but by our judgments about events. But here is the part most people skip. That disturbance does not end when the event ends. It continues for as long as you keep feeding it with attention. Every time you replay the provocation in your mind, you are not processing it. You are reinforcing it. You are re-experiencing the emotional state of the original moment, and each repetition makes the next provocation easier to land. Think about that for a second. The provocateur has long moved on. You are still in the fight they staged, alone, without them, delivering the emotional damage they could not deliver directly. Researchers studying rumination found that the psychological cost of unresolved interpersonal conflict is often far greater than the cost of the original event. The event was 60 seconds. The rumination can run for 60 hours. And across that time, your sleep, your focus, your decision-making, and your presence in other relationships are all compromised. You have been manipulated twice. Once in the moment, once in the aftermath. Every person who deliberately provokes others has learned something at some point in their life. They have learned that your emotional reaction gives them information, access, or control that they cannot get any other way. They may have learned it in childhood from a parent whose moods were unpredictable. They may have learned it in relationships where emotional volatility was confused with intensity. They may have learned it in professional environments where the person who could stay calm while others lost composure consistently held more power. The point is not to excuse the behavior. The point is to understand the mechanism. Because when you understand that provocation is a learned strategy rather than an involuntary outburst, you stop taking it personally. And the moment you stop taking it personally, its power over you drops significantly. Seneca once wrote that the greatest power a person can have over you is the power to disturb your peace, and that power is not inherent. It is granted. You are the one who grants it, usually without realizing that is what you are doing. When someone who has relied on your reaction suddenly finds that reaction no longer available, something specific happens in them. The control architect escalates, as we discussed. But the others experience something closer to confusion. Then recalibration. Then, in many cases, a quiet form of respect. Because a person who cannot be provoked is a person who cannot be predicted. And an unpredictable person is dangerous to control. This is what I mentioned earlier, and it is the piece that changes how you see every future interaction. What happens when the provocation stops working? Sometimes it is strategic retreat. They file the information that this tactic does not work on you anymore, and they look for another angle. They are not done. They are adapting. Other times it is genuine withdrawal. The relationship was built on a dynamic where your reaction was the currency. Remove the currency and there is nothing left to sustain the exchange. They leave, and this can feel like loss, especially if you cared about the person. But what actually leaves is the version of the relationship that required your suffering to function. And sometimes, in the rarest cases, it is the beginning of a genuine shift. Some people have never encountered someone who could absorb their provocation without either fighting back or falling apart. The experience of hitting something that does not move can, in specific people, produce a moment of genuine self-examination. They do not always use that moment well. But the moment exists, and it was created entirely by your stillness. The Stoic response to all of this is not indifference. It is not coldness. It is not the suppression of feeling. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. What he meant was not that you feel nothing. He meant that what you feel does not have to become what you do. That gap between feeling and action is where your freedom lives. And closing that gap is not a personality trait. It is a practice, built deliberately, maintained daily, made stronger every time someone tries to reach across it and finds nothing to grab, because that provocation, that carefully timed push, that calculated attempt to extract your reaction, it was never about you, and your peace was never theirs to take.